War, considered a last resort in most cases, over disputes, territories, power, dominance, wealth, envy, retribution, vengeance, different peoples, countries, ethnicities, or powers, but what drives war between the same people with a common language and culture, living within the same borders and under the same flag, families of the same blood on two different sides of a warring faction, where everything's the same but the ideology. Is ideology worth tearing apart families, separating fathers from families permanently by way of death, uprooting civility, and turning the civilization in which they live upside down, exposing mothers, children, and others not fighting in the conflict to fight for survival in chaos and uncertainty? Compromises, negotiations, talks, resolutions, and mediations are some ways used to prevent conflict. Conflict usually the last measure, but here in America usually or normally don't seem to apply. Looking back at the Civil War, expected by some to take a weekend, lasting 4 years, immediately after Lincoln's election, Southern states declared war, followed soon after by the rest of the Southern states completely unprovoked, but they could see for the first time an opposing faction, which was a threat to their monopolistic power, centered around an agricultural economy, which they thought relied on slavery and cultural dominance, but it wasn't all about the economy. Their economy was already a disaster. The small advantage of the cotton gin, which was the farmer's edge over the world for a time, was ending. Slavery at the time of the Civil War had already been on a downward spiral. States, local banks, and other entities issued banknotes, usually having nothing behind it, causing steep inflation and mistrust for distant trade. 9 out of 10 plantations were in debt. Lincoln had initially proclaimed not to allow further states to join in on what they called at the time the peculiar institution. The South was poor, backwards, undeveloped, lacked machinery and industry. Unlike the North, the antebellum South ideology had roots in classical ideas, aristocratic philosophy, turning against individual equality of the liberal Enlightenment, the free market and free labor. Southerners were staunch anti-capitalist, believing it left workers destitute. Their plantation system was to be a closed, harmonious system. Big plantations produced everything on location: cobbler, blacksmith, food, clothing, and materials internally, reflecting the serf-style plantations of Old North Europe. George Fitzhugh, a Virginia writer and lawyer during the antebellum South, called the plantation system socialism. They thought free white laborers live in a dog-eat-dog world or starve if one couldn't compete, that the free white laborers had no job, security, didn't eat meat on a regular basis, lacked permanent housing, didn't have access to medicine, and only worked enough to afford the necessities and liquor. Meanwhile, they argued in contrast to their paternalistic, structured order of progress and self-sufficiency as they saw it, where everyone had a place and worked at their ability and was given to their needs, where the upper class could learn, poetry read, strategize, innovate, educate, and procure for the plantation. The central power that managed the market affairs and redistributed it within the plantation, while skimming off the top. Much like communism, you have your working class who are all equal among each other, and your political class, eliminating class struggle by creating two classes necessary in their view for the progress and betterment of man, a permanent welfare state. The antebellum South and communism both attacked free market capitalism as cruel, exploitative, and unstable. Both praised a system where everyone was provided for according to rule. Both had a working class and a small privileged class. Both were authoritarian and demanded obedience. Both eliminated class struggle by creating two classes, one political, the other racial. Marx, who wrote for the New York Tribune at the time of the war, said that capitalism is a form of slavery with exploited wages, as it collapsed into desperation. The South was ideological and diametrically opposed in ideology, philosophy, culture, work ethic, industriousness, in habit and worldview. In the North, the free market, enlightenment, liberalism ideology grew into the Republican Party. Many were Quaker and other denominations who saw slavery as a moral evil and centered themselves as the abolitionist party, like John Brown, who sacrificed himself and 6 of his sons fighting against slavery. Prior to the time of the Civil War, there was savage political slander and vilification, much like today. The Civil War was a war of the parties, Republican versus Democrat, each having a strong hold over their region. The Republican North and Democrat South. Lincoln was the first Republican elected in 1860 and narrowly won, only because the vote was split between 3 others, 2 of which were Democrats who had most of the pull and had dominated for much of America's history. After the Civil War, Ex-Confederate soldiers gathered into the KKK as a terrorist wing to further Democrat power in the South. After Lincoln's death, his vice president, a Democrat, was lenient and slowed down Reconstruction efforts. The Klan took the opportunity to lynch blacks and whites alike, most of which were Republican, to try to suppress the Republican vote. In the southern states, blacks were almost universally Republicans. Republican President General Grant strengthened Reconstruction efforts in the South and fought white supremacy, like the Enforcement Act of 1870 to authorize federal supervision of elections and the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871. He supported black politicians, strengthened the Freedmen's Bureau and civil rights, and signed the Civil Rights Act of 1875, one of 7 by 1964, when finally being recognized by Democrats and passed overwhelmingly by Republicans, finally bringing an end to the Jim Crow South. This brings up the party switch lie that the racist Democrats joined the Republicans who had been writing the Civil Rights Acts in an act of protest, which makes absolutely no sense. Out of all the Dixiecrat politicians, only one switched to the Republican Party. Storm Thurmond, who said he did it because he found Jesus and was no longer racist, in direct confliction of the narrative lie. No Republican switched either. If anyone would switch, we have a prime example of a Dixiecrat who was the grand cyclops of the Klan in office, Robert Byrd, who, along with Biden, voted against desegregation. Nor did he switch Republican. He died a Democrat in 2015. Biden, Clinton, and Obama spoke at his eulogy and praised him as a mentor. Another lie is the Southern strategy, that Nixon's campaign for the Deep South was for the racist vote, therefore the person who gets the Deep South vote must be a racist. But he didn't campaign in the Deep South, and the Deep South vote went to his Democrat opponent. The narrative is based on lies, and when you confront them with the truth, they make up yet another lie to further the propaganda they rely on. The public's ignorance of detail, lack of deep study, and reverberation of propaganda from multiple sources, as the majority being left-wing media, to reinforce the lie as a common perception, vilification, and dehumanization. As we've discussed with the calling of Republicans as Klansmen is absurd, trying to distance the truth from themselves and pin it on their opponents, the same opponents targeted and killed by this organization to begin with. They also call Republicans Nazis and Trump Hitler. Again, an absurd claim. The Nazis were in fact left-wing socialists. Hitler's plan after the war was to tighten his planned economy. He thought all work legitimate, and therefore workers should be given one pay scale, regardless of if you were a trash man or doctor. He had price control for what they deemed essential goods, making it a crime to profit, making it mandatory to sell at a set price, even if that price was less than what the store owner purchased it for. Ludwig van Mises's book, Omnipotent Government, breaks down their economic and social agenda, and it clearly defines them on the left. Their 25-point plan aligns with the left-wing agenda, like, for instance, nationalization of businesses, abolition of passive income from investments, profit sharing in large industries, expansion of welfare, land reform, nationalization of banks and department stores, prohibition of war profiting, communization of large business supply and necessities, citizen housing, national education, regulating religion where it may endanger the state, a strong central state with unlimited authority, state-controlled media and censorship, and the elevation of the common good over the individual, the duty to society, which is the right to government, not from government, a defining principle which separates the American Revolution from the socialist French Revolution. Hitler expressly stated Germany as a state working towards social justice and hated the Jews because they were money-lending capitalists, which was also echoed by Marx himself. He believed, as Marx did, in the economic eventuality of diminishing markets, that capitalism leads to monopolies, and in socialism, the government's picking and choosing of markets and industries which align with their ideology or goals, not economic practicality, using the government to suppress their competition. This brings us into fascism and Benito Mussolini. Corporatism. Fascism was the state and the corporation, working hand in hand under the directive, and for the projection of the state, Mussolini began as a Marxist socialist until refining it with Giovanni Gentili, creating fascism, before he took on from class struggle to state unity, from materialism to idealistic collectivism, from international to national corporatism. Mussolini split socialism from communism, similarly to the Nazis later, who said the red of the Nazi flag was to invite communists to his form of socialism. They set measures that would keep independent endeavors in line under threat, like how they didn't abolish private property, but if you went outside of the parameters, your business was seized and given over to those loyal to the party. Without private property rights, you essentially don't have private property. It makes the store owner simply a manager of his own business who must strictly follow the platform's guidance. Russia, Nazis, and Mussolini were all generally within the same spectrum of leftism, as proven by James Gregor's book, Marxism, Fascism, and Totalitarianism, and Reitman's books, including Hitler's National Socialism. Their breaking of alliance later in the war wasn't because they were diametrically opposed. It was due to their competition for whose form would prevail. After Hitler's turn on Stalin was the first time the Nazis were labeled as right-wing by Stalin to vilify them as not true of the communist cause, which was later used by the left, though only to the right of a communist. The American left and media praised Hitler's Germany early on as a progressive state. Hitler used the Democrats' Jim Crow laws as a framework to exclude Jews. In America, over the last 10 years, the left has vilified Republicans as racist, Klansmen, and Nazis, precisely what the Republicans have stood against and are principally opposed to. They're trying to wash their sins and paint them upon their opponents. How is it that the Democrat Party of slavery and Jim Crow, both forced to an end by Republicans, is suddenly the saviors of the blacks and minorities, and the Republicans who stop them as the racist? The Republican view is based on individuality and merit. If someone is viewed as an individual, you cannot have collective viewpoints, so you cannot have racism. Racism is a collective. The left-wing collective view is the same, regardless if it's a collective of whites or blacks or minorities or gathering different collective groups against an opponent. The Democrats simply used one collective before 1964 and applied it to other collectives at the time when racism had waned below its usefulness. They are hardly on the side of compassion and the underdog. It is simply about power through manipulation. How about their own words? Trump is Hitler, I don't think. I need to show this as a fact unless you're Helen Keller. Maxine Waters said on June 23, 2018, at a rally in L.A., if you see anybody from Trump's cabinet in a restaurant, in the department store, at a gasoline station, you get out and you create a crowd and you push back on them and you tell them you're not welcome anymore anywhere. During the BLM protests that burned down America for 8 months, including police stations as seen in the media's narrative, fiery but peaceful, Kamala Harris not only organized mass bailouts of rioters, but publicly stated they won't stop and shouldn't stop. As a persuasion to Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, Supreme Court justices, Schumer said, I want to tell you, Gorsuch, I want to tell you, Kavanaugh, you have released the whirlwind and you will pay the price. You won't know what hit you if you go forward with these awful decisions. Banging on the Supreme Court doors with no pushback from Democrat leaders. In response to George Floyd, BLM protesters burned St. John's Episcopal Church in D.C. This is the same church that Lincoln attended. At the same protest, they tried tearing down the fence outside the White House, forcing President Trump to retreat to his bunker. On January 6th, where most people walked within the boundary walkway, and others were escorted around by police. But that day is viewed as one of the greatest insurrections in history. For years, they even tried to associate it with a cop who died a week later due to unrelated health causes. The only one killed was a Republican woman, Ashley Babbitt, shot in the neck through a window by a cop inside. This also ignores the newly discovered evidence of federal agencies on scene to help facilitate a riot, like Roy Epps, who said, "We're here to storm the Capitol." He encouraged people to the Capitol after Trump's speech and participated in pushing past police barricades and helped push a large metal sign into police officers and was only given 1-year probation of 100 hours of community service, whereas others who never even went into the building were arrested and given multiple years in jail. Like one man who was given 7.25 years in prison, Enrique Taro, who was a leader of the Proud Boys, was arrested immediately after debarking off a bus in D.C. and given 22 years. Others of the group, like Ethan Nordine, got 18 years, and Dominic Puzzola got 10. The Proud Boys were labeled as a far-right racist organization by the SPLC and ADL, even though it's a multi-ethnic organization. Patriotism is seen as a threat. The ACLU representatives have tweeted criticisms of the American flag. In 2021, the ACLU of Massachusetts retweeted a journalist who said seeing lots of American flags on January 6th at the Capitol made him uneasy. During the presidential campaign, Kamala Harris criticized Trump for planning a campaign event in Howell, Michigan, because there was a KKK presence in the past. Journalists asked about it, and Trump's response was, "Who was here in 2021, where they had to admit Joe Biden?" about Trump's Madison Square rally. They called it a Nazi rally because there had been one there almost 100 years ago. The use of Madison Square Garden included Democrats many, many times. And in 1924, the Democrat National Convention was nicknamed the Klan Bake. In 76, Jimmy Carter was nominated as a presidential Democratic candidate and renominated in 1980, there Clinton in 92. And over the course of decades, it's been used for Democrat rallies, speeches, and campaigns. This is not a both sides issue. Right-wing hate has been normalized by many people, from Kathy Griffin holding up a severed head of Trump to Snoop Dogg, Obama, Kamala Harris, AOC, Jasmine Crockett, Elizabeth Warren, Maxine Waters, Chuck Schumer, and other prominent politicians and media groups. Joe Biden said on stage in a presidential speech that the Republicans are an existential threat to America. Elizabeth Warren, when asked after Charlie Kirk's assassination about toning down rhetoric, quickly pivoted to Trump. Jasmine Crockett, when asked on The Breakfast Club, pivoted to the right as the problem, saying that the facts say that we have a white supremacy problem in this country. Nancy Pelosi had said, "I don't know why there aren't uprisings all over the country, and maybe there will be." The left has praised recent assassins, such as Luigi Mangione, who was celebrated for killing the CEO of a healthcare company. 45% of people said it's sometimes okay to have action against words. Charlie Kirk himself was quite aware of the dangers of today's left. In a post on his account, he wrote, "Assassination culture is spreading on the left. 48% of liberals say it would be at least somewhat justified to murder Elon Musk. 55% said the same about Donald Trump. In California, activists are naming ballot measures after Luigi Mangione. The left is being whipped into a violent frenzy. Any setback, with losing an election or losing a court case, justifies a maximally violent response. This is the natural outgrowth of left-wing protest culture, tolerating violence and mayhem for years on end. The cowardice of local prosecutors and school officials have turned the left into a ticking time bomb." The Anti-Defamation League has been cited recently in the media as a valid study when talking about the percentage of right-wing violence. The ADL publishes an annual report called Murder and Extremism in the United States. In their most recent report, they claim up to 75% of extremist murders are committed by people they classified as right-wing extremist, 4 to 10% by left-wing extremist. The rest are labeled as unclear. Right-wing in ADL terms covers white supremacy, neo-Nazis, and skinheads. As said before, they're collectivist and economically socialist, both left-wing principles. Left-wing groups like communist have a long list of discrimination and anti-Semitism, including Russia, China, North Korea, Ethiopia, Chechens, East Germany, and Cambodia. Eastern Europe targeted the Roma Gypsies and Jews in Poland. Cuba targeted blacks who faced discrimination, along with Chinese Cubans. American communists, while often opposing segregation and recruiting black members, still would sideline racial issues in favor of class and unity, and expelled members who insisted on black autonomy. The new left groups of the 60s and 70s were dismissive or hostile towards Jews, and sometimes slipped into anti-Semitic conspiracies. They would often replace struggle with ethnic scapegoating when it served political control. Repression was often framed as anti-nationalist, anti-separatist, but it effectively punished people because of their ethnicity, religion, or ancestry, sometimes through universalism, where minority and identity groups must disappear. So communism and left-wing movements have plenty of history with racism and racial targeting, including anti-Semitism. They also categorize with the right anti-government militias and anti-government groups which are not restricted to the right, especially considering those wanting a communist revolution. Left-wing extremism covers some anarchist, eco-terrorist, or animal rights radicals. They do not classify Antifa-linked assaults, riots, or property destruction as left-wing extremist violence. Conveniently, they only classify left-wing extremism with things that don't usually cause murder. The trans school shooter in Nashville, Tennessee, and the trans shooter at the Catholic Church and school shooting in Minneapolis are both not factored under left-wing violence. By focusing on homicides, the ADL excludes widespread left-wing violence that doesn't result in death. The 2020 riots after George Floyd's death involved dozens of arsons, assaults, and billions in property damage, but attributed very few killings directly to left-wing groups. Those deaths don't show up in ADL murder data. The study is clearly classification bias. If someone with no ideology commits violence during a left-leaning protest, the ADL often files it under non-ideological rather than left. Meanwhile, fringe right-wing actors are almost always categorized on the right, even if their motivation is mixed with loose political rhetoric. The ADL also doesn't track killings from police or other entities during unrest. The ADL is said to be fighting anti-Semitism, which they assume is coming from white supremacy groups. They consider right-wing, irrespective of Muslims or other anti-Semitic groups, clearly on the left, heavily skewing the results, even counting neo-Nazis as right-wing. The left-wing riots in 2020 alone had more violence than right-wing extremism over the entire past decade. By classifying cases asymmetrically, the ADL produces stats that emphasize right-wing violence and minimizes left-wing violence. Political violence in America seems to show a pattern. A Bernie Sanders supporter and volunteer for his 2016 campaign shot at Republicans during a baseball game, where Steve Scalise was shot and several others wounded. Melissa Hortman, a state representative, was killed alongside her husband by an attacker who was a Tim Walz appointee. The killer had other motives too, but he said specifically when asked that it had nothing to do with Trump, Republican Nancy Mace was physically accosted for transgender issues. Democrat Governor Shapiro was attacked by a pro-Palestinian. Republican Ron Paul was attacked in 2017. Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh was targeted due to abortion issues. Trump's multiple assassination attempts and other Democrat targets like the 20-plus pro-life organizations that were vandalized and firebombed. Tesla dealerships were burned. They attacked ICE facilities and related riots like where they attacked cops in recent Los Angeles riots. Some willing to commit assassination are mentally ill and don't necessarily have political motives, but many do, and there seems to be a pattern. Leaving aside the mentally ill, those targeted have a history of being on the right and the assassins or attempted assassins on the left, or in the case of Democrats to the left of themselves. Lincoln, Garfield, McKinley, and Kennedy are all successful presidential assassinations, which also show this pattern. Kennedy was killed by Oswald, a communist. Attempted assassinations of presidents like Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, Truman, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, and Obama, and 4 attempts on Trump, where almost all the assassins were on the left. Critical race theory like Derek Bell started in the 60s, started a racial framework that has been popularized today by people like Ibram X. Kendi, where fighting inequality or anti-racist means always looking at race to give favor to a race by reinforcing inequality to create equality or as a form of reparations. No one denies they're on the left, which is racially focused. Whether racially focused on a black or brown group or a white group, they're both two sides of the same coin. Black leftist or communist groups have plenty in common with antebellum ideology of the white Southerners. Anti-free market rejected individualism, the selling of labor in a free market. They thought wage labor was worse than slavery because it created an underclass of poor, rootless workers. They both thought it created class struggle between whites and blacks. They were paternalistic, the providers of food, housing, clothing, medicine, and discipline in return for labor. The state gives, so you now have a social duty to the system. Egalitarianism creates an upper or ruling class to distribute and mediate, therefore still creating the social hierarchies they claim to fight. Uri Basmanov was a former KGB propaganda agent who defected to the West in 1970. In 1984, he was interviewed by Edward Griffin about ideological subversion and how the Soviet Union sought to weaken the U.S. from within. 80% of work was psychological warfare. Most of the American politicians, media, and educational system train another generation of people who think they're living at a time of peace. False. The U.S. is in a state of war, undeclared war against the basic principles of American values. He said the first tactic was demoralization, undermine the moral fabric and values of society by infiltrating schools, universities, media, and culture with Marxist ideology. Once a generation is raised believing anti-American ideals, they've been conditioned beyond return. Destabilization was next, targeting the pillars of society, economy, defense, and foreign relations by weakening confidence in the systems. He argued left-wing policies of overregulation, pacifism, and inflationary spending were intentionally destabilizing, the focus being on shifting the country's target away from self-reliance and strength. Crisis allows for revolutionary change by way of economic collapse, war or civil unrest, racial conflict, strikes or shortages as triggers after the crisis. A new regime takes power promising to restore order. Useful idiots, once used to help spread Marxist ideology, like intellectuals, professors, and journalists, are no longer needed. Schools are primary battlegrounds. Culture, media, music, and TV to subtlety introduce ideas that weaken American tradition, religion, family, and patriotism. He stated Marxist concepts are unwittingly used by intellectuals and liberals to bring down their own society while believing they're fighting for progress. Without an awakening to core values, the process is largely irreversible. The media is a perfect example of such manipulation after people are censored or fired for their vile outtakes about Charlie Kirk's assassination. The media targeted the right as villains for cancel culture and defend themselves, using the rights of free speech against them. The media already laying out a narrative about how the assassin was on the right himself, a blatant lie proven not just by what his friends and family said about him being on the left, but by the anti-fascist slogans and symbols like 3 arrows down that were left on the bullets. The media set a narrative about free speech, not just as a positive, but as hypocritical deflection from the vile things they said. Instead of condemning the left, they celebrate to rub it in. They use Charlie Kirk's words out of context against him to defame his name. They attack vigils, and when any consequence is given, they become the victim. When the judicial system is undermined and fact-checkers can no longer be trusted. When people are told there's fascists and Nazis in their midst, and that their opponents are an existential threat to America, what type of climate is expected to be created when groups of people chant about how they spit on Charlie Kirk's grave, vandalize and destroy vigils right in front of groups of the grieving? Looking for confrontation, it's only the right's restraint keeping the peace. They obviously feel confident that nothing will happen to them, which is an acknowledgement that the right is not to be feared, which might be what's enabling their actions. When reality is bent, when violence is excused, when the truth is selectively filtered, when trust in law and institutions are deliberately eroded, and once people no longer agree on what is legitimate, that is how a nation fractures. That is how civil war begins. The constant targeting, vilification, and dehumanization methods used to demoralize and destabilize a nation only can benefit those looking for power through revolution. We can't fight hate with hate or violence with violence. Only education and open discourse, which is exactly what Charlie Kirk was shot for doing. And he was absolutely right when he said, when people stop talking, that's when you get violence. That's when civil war happens, because you start to think the other side is so evil and they lose their humanity